All right, hello and welcome to another episode of A Fresh Perspective with Jeff Charles, where we prefer truth over narrative and principles over personalities with your boy, your favorite conservatarian, me, Jeff Charles. Now, I know it's been a while. It has been a while since I've done a video. I took a little bit of a break because I got a little burned out, but I'm back. And I've got another fire conversation for you guys today. But before I get into that, just want to remind you that LibertyNation.com is a proud sponsor of A Fresh Perspective with Jeff Charles. Check out LibertyNation.com for all of your conservatarian news, original articles, analysis, videos, podcasts, Liberty Nation Radio with myself, and their signature TV program, The Conservative Five, all on LibertyNation.com. Conservative news where truth matters. And also, as always, be sure to share this video. Hit that share button right now. It only takes 2 seconds. That helps me out a lot. Please like this video. Give me a thumbs up. And if you haven't already subscribed, what the hell are you doing? What are you doing with your life if you haven't already subscribed? Hit that subscribe button. Hit that notification bell. That way you'll be notified every time I upload a new video. But without further ado, I'm going to bring on my guest here. I am speaking with Frederick, a research fellow in tech policy at the Heritage Foundation, and we are going to be talking big tech. She recently gave a testimony in front of Congress, and she's got a lot to say about these issues. So welcome to my show, Miss Frederick.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, before we get started, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
All right. So I'm a research fellow in technology policy at the Heritage Foundation, quite a mouthful, but I basically look at big tech policy. So how does the conservative movement find conservative solutions to a lot of the problems that we're facing with these big tech companies today? Before that, I worked in a smaller think tank, but I worked for Facebook at Facebook headquarters in Menlo Park, California. And I led a counterterrorism analysis team for the global security shop at Facebook. So, walking through the halls as a conservative, of course I was closeted or else I probably wouldn't have survived. But walking through those hallways and, figuring out what to do about terrorists on the platform, how to identify them, how to help other teams get them off of the platform, and also detect some of the patterns that they used as well. So it could give the senior leadership a better idea of how these actors operated, both on and even off these platforms as well.
That's very interesting. So did you do a lot of collaboration with Homeland Security, or how did that work?
So these teams, especially the counterterrorism and InfoSec teams, information security teams, they work with law enforcement, and Facebook publishes their transparency reports on law enforcement requests, the law enforcement responses they have. So basically what they say to law enforcement when they ask for information on certain individuals on the platform with regard to terrorism. They do this for child exploitation too. And again, they publish this all very publicly. So there is engagement with federal entities when it comes to illegal activities such as those two things. For my part, I came from the government, actually. They were looking for ways to sort of make these programs a little more structured and august by the time that I got there in 2016. So there was a lot of pulling from people who'd worked in these big government bureaucracies. I was an intelligence officer targeting Al-Qaeda, and we looked at the way terrorists behaved on platforms, outside of platforms as well. So these big tech companies wanted to sort of draw some of that expertise from the government and institute their own ways of doing things with that know-how. So yeah, there was some interplay between various government agencies for that illegal activity, but it was mostly, as we said, building the airplane in mid-flight and figuring out what Facebook itself could do with this.
Gotcha. So, I mean, that's, it's funny. We're going to talk about big tech, but what you just said could be its own interview. So I hope I can talk to you about that too, because that sounds very interesting. But I wanted to find out. So how long were you at Facebook?
Yep. So I was only there for a year and change. So 2016 and 2017.
Gotcha. Okay. And you mentioned being a closeted conservative there. Do you think that there are a lot of closeted conservatives there, just a few, or?
Yeah, so I think the Silicon Valley mindset in particular tends to have more of a libertarian patina. So a lot of the
Okay.
people, the founders, those who are going to, or who were going to, this place on the West Coast to create and build things, sort of free from the government's prying eyes and to move really quickly, they tend to be more libertarian minded. The most famous of
Mm.
these is Peter Thiel, right?
Your deal, yeah.
Famously, again, a Trump supporter, though. So something to think about there. But at the same time, I think most people, especially at the founder level, the actual programmers, the people with their hands in the data who want to work with these machines and create things and build, they tend to be more sort of libertarian and sort of take advantage of that presence on the West Coast and the newness and the programming talent coming out of Stanford, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's only really, and especially recently, it's these mid-level employees and HR people and other sort of, at these what we would call cost centers in these companies that
Mhm.
tend to be the more vociferous lefties, and they're sort of
Mm.
flooding into these companies now because they're super loud and they feel like they can speak safely. There are better people at the Daily Wire who talk with more granularity about this. Mike Solana as well talks about this too, and sort of describes that stratification in companies when you have the programmers and the founders and the people doing the real work of these tech companies
Right.
are more libertarian minded, and then you have the admin classes. They could be product managers too, as Mike Solana says accurately, who have a different sort of ideological perspective of the world.
So how does that even work? I mean, because we're about to talk about censorship, but I mean, if the leadership of these companies is more libertarian minded, like you're saying, how is it that these other people are able to enact the censorship the way that they are? You would think that the libertarians in power would shut that down. Like, how does that play out?
You would think, but as you can see, there's no price to pay in our culture among shareholders for being a lefty right now. So you look at Nike, you look at the NBA. Yeah, people, some brave souls are talking out about this, but at the same time, mostly if you go along with the prevailing leftist narrative that's captured Hollywood, that's captured big corporations, that's captured the academy, that's captured most of the organs of our culture these days, especially schools, then it's the path of least resistance. So you don't
I
pay
see.
as big a cultural price for going along with that. So I think even if individually Mark Zuckerberg and people like Jack Dorsey and the heads of these companies tend to be more libertarian minded, I mean, look at the early things that they're saying. Look at Mark Zuckerberg when he got in so much trouble with Kara Swisher for saying, I think freedom of expression matters and certain people should be on the platform no matter what they have to say. He got crushed in the press about this, these ideological journalists who want one thing, one outcome to go one way, that's the leftist way. Then of course they're going to get steamrolled because every single organ of culture, as I said, every journalist is against them. Then they're paying a much higher price to live out their libertarian ideals.
Yes.
You take the case of Palmer Luckey, who started this wildly successful company in the defense industry space called Anduril. It's an artificial intelligence company. He was famously a Trump supporter, and people went wild about the fact that he had different political leanings. And his company, Oculus, was purchased by Facebook. He became a billionaire. He's doing great things in the world. So he's laughing all the way to the bank. But
Right.
ultimately, his viewpoint, it was untenable and that he was that public about it. So yeah, you would think that level of founder would be insulated from these layers of admin and product managers and HR folks, but
Mhm.
clearly that hasn't been the case. You look at the effects or look at what's actually happened, and you'll see that it's too much of a tide to fight against for long.
Yeah, so that actually explains a lot of it. That's a very interesting dynamic. I mean, and as long as there's not going to be consequences for allowing this to happen, then might as well just keep keep the employees happy and keep the media happy. I mean, you brought the word journalists. I don't call them journalists. I call them media activists because that's what they are. They are media
Exactly
activists
right.
working for an activist media. I mean, I just recently wrote an article about Axios publishing a report complaining that conservative media is on the rise. And I even found an interview from last year with one of the co-founders of Axios, who was calling out Mark Zuckerberg for creating a right-wing echo chamber on Facebook. And I'm like, do you think anybody actually buys that? Because I don't think even you believe that.
That's
It's
exactly
amazing.
right. Yeah, you can't drive people into echo chambers and then decry them. That is something that, and we saw this coming years and years ago, like when people were saying, oh, the conservatives, they're talking on their own platforms. Look at Parler. Look how evil that is. When you have Amazon Web Services, which was their cloud hosting infrastructure service provider, when they pull the rug out of a digital platform like that at the mid-tier layer of the stack, then you have a problem. Then yes, conservatives have no choice but to build their own companies at all.
Which is what they told us to do anyway. Well, if you don't like it, build your own. Okay,
exactly.
You build your own. No, don't build your own.
Precisely. So, we can't win at that point, and I think this is sort of a message to founders, right? Like people like Martina Vila at RightForge, they said they're going to host Trump's new platform. They're building with cloud services in mind. They have a lot of capabilities and services at most layers of the stack, and that's good. Look at Rumble, billionaire backer Peter Thiel. There he goes again. JD Vance. Those guys are putting their money where their mouths are, and they're sort of saying, yeah, we need platforms that are insulated from these vulnerabilities that AWS pushes on other companies like Parler, and we're going to be able to have an array of digital services that will help insulate us from that form of censorship at all levels of the stack. That is critical. So yeah, when you have activists, as you say, decrying these echo chambers that we've been forced to build, I think that lays the lie pretty bare.
Yeah, and I like that this is happening because I've been calling for conservatives to do this. I will say that I hate that they have to do it. I hate that they even have to do it. But since they do, yeah, I mean, they should be going to RightForge to host their websites because Amazon Web Services will shut them down if they find an excuse. The bottom line of these people, these are authoritarians. So they don't want our views on the internet at all. And they hate the fact that we've been able to subvert it. They hated Rush Limbaugh for subverting the mainstream activist media. So this is just the same thing. The thing is, they don't want conservatives to be able to express their views on a platform that they don't control. So that's why they're freaking out about this. And I think that's why why we're having so many issues with censorship in general, which is causing this. I wanted to ask, at Facebook, I mean, if you can't answer certain things, and just shut me down if I ask something that you can't answer, but did you see a lot of this censorship going on, or were people talking about how they suppress certain views or the steps that they take to shadow ban people or anything like that? Or
at that time, and I left in 2017, no. I mean, not that I was aware of. Again, I was purely focused on counterterrorism to the highest degree. That was the biggest part of my remit there. So I would not have been in those conversations if they were happening. I don't know that they were. I think from what you've seen onward, from especially, I think that Donald Trump's election in 2016, which I was there for, the place afterwards was like a funeral when he won. But I think that in 2016, people, and you had that Cambridge Analytica scandal and whatnot, people got nervous because the activist media was looking for someone to blame for Trump's victory. And a lot of that blame, I think wrongly, fell on Facebook because people were saying, oh, Russian interference, people looking at memes caused them to change how they thought about pulling the lever in the ballot bot in the booth. We still can't prove that was the case, that any of this, Russia's attempt to intervene in our elections, if that actually made a substantial difference in the result of the vote itself.
It didn't. They actually found that it didn't.
Exactly. Yeah. At best, the scholarship is sort of throwing, there's no definitive conclusion that tracks with what the narrative from the media is. So I think that it's important to sort of look at that as when Facebook started clamping down on what they saw as conservative success. And you have, from the whistleblower documents, Facebook files published by the Wall Street Journal, the fact that Facebook created 2 internal tools in the aftermath of that 2016 Trump victory that suppressed very conservative media on the site. They measured out how much, by tens of percentages, some of these outlets, more traffic, some of these outlets would have got on Facebook had those tools been removed. And as of the Wall Street Journal publishing in October 2021, they were still using one of those tools. So they sort of leapt into action at that time. I think public pressure had a lot to do with it. And then I think that's when the conservative censorship really started in earnest. And Twitter kind of, that's an interesting case. There was a really interesting article that came out in 2019 in February. I'm going to butcher his name, Richard Hanania, but guy who's not an ideologue, a serious scholar. He wrote for Quillette that a lot of Twitter's suspensions of prominent politically active individuals started happening in 2015. He was using a smaller data set, but he was canvassing politically active prominent individuals who had an expressed preference for one of the presidential candidates in 2016. And he found that by 21-1, of those who were suspended from Twitter since the inception of the platform, and all the suspensions really started in earnest in his data set at 2015, he found that the ratio 21-1, those suspended from Twitter who met that criterion were on expressing support for Donald Trump. So they were in the conservative category. Again, something, food for thought. We're actually able to sort of put numbers to what we're sensing, what we're seeing on these platforms. And that's just sort of the smaller end of the scale. There are bigger studies done by the Media Research Center and whatnot that show these ratios more starkly as well. So I think a lot of it really happened sort of in that time frame. For Facebook, it was mostly the 2016 getting blamed for Donald Trump's victory that really started this. Okay, our human reviewers are going to get a little more stringent when it comes to what we would consider conservative content and users.
Yeah, 21-1. That is a huge ratio. I'm sure that maybe some of those people may have brought it on themselves. And I know that sometimes people do that stuff on purpose to get suspended so they can complain about it. But 21-1, no, that is a very clear bias. There's no way that conservatives are violating terms and conditions at a 21-1 ratio. That doesn't make sense. And so it does paint a picture that can't really avoid. It's amazing when people say, oh, there's no bias in how they suspend people. Yeah, of course there is.
And the author noted that in his study. He said, even if every single one of these people or most of these people were a little crazy and tended to violate the rules a little more, that still would not account for that ratio that he got. Yes. So he, again, very serious scholar, not an ideologue. And I think that data set's interesting. It's open source, so you can look at the data that he parsed through too. And at this point, again, like I said, when it comes to the Media Research Center, they are conservatives, yes, but we need a watchdog. We need people to do this. And you get any institution these days in academia or not, they're not going to do serious studies on this. They're just not at this point. And because number one, most people are receiving money from these big tech companies, which again, not until it's 2021. People know what time it is now. We see what is going on now. I don't think there's any way to deny this when you look at the president being dumped from all of those digital platforms, 17 digital platforms to be exact, within 2 weeks in January. And then you see the CCP, Iranian officials, North Korean officials, and the Taliban getting on these American-owned companies and being able to say what they want. Sometimes there are minor consequences when people call them out, but not until then. For people to deny that this is happening, and people still try to, then you're not looking at reality anymore. We've lost you.
Yeah. Or you're just lying. I think that's a lot of it too. But, so you were recently involved in a congressional hearing And you called big tech the enemy of the people, which is a pretty charged term. I mean, we heard President Trump use that about the fake news media. I actually use it about the activist media. I say the activist media is the enemy of the people. But what made you use that specific label as it relates to big tech? What makes them the enemy of the people?
I think it's everything that we've been talking about in, the past minutes that we've been talking. It's those hard data points, that continued conservative censorship, opacity of content moderation decisions, inconsistent enforcement of vague policies, a lack of transparency, a lack of recourse for people, especially when they've been, frankly, discriminated against by these platforms for their viewpoints. And then the blatant hypocrisy, again, that allows enemies of America, actual enemies like the CCP, the Taliban, Iran, to be on these platforms and spew whatever nonsense that they want to spew. When you are allowing our adversaries to propagandize to their heart's content, and you're not allowing a mom to question the efficacy of a cloth mask over her young child, then you are an enemy of the people. When 1 in 6 Biden voters would have claimed that had you tech companies not actively suppressed specific information, in this case, the Hunter Biden laptop story, then they would have voted differently. Then you're messing with people's heads at that point on purpose. Right. You're manipulating them. When 52% of Americans believe that social media suppression of that Hunter Biden laptop story, this is according to McLaughlin and Associates, when they believe that that constituted election interference over half of Americans, then you're an enemy of the people. When you work hand in glove with the government, like Jen Psaki said they were doing to police speech on the platform, then you're an enemy of the people. So in my mind, when you're taking down people's opinions about the Wuhan lab leak theory, then saying that this is misinformation and how dare they purvey it until it comes out that, no, this is a pretty legitimate theory, then you're an enemy of the people. You're stifling free expression, you're chilling open discourse, which makes this country a healthy one, and you're engendering self-censorship. That's not a world that I want to live in. That's not America. That you're edging closer to a reality that looks more like what people under the CCP's iron fist live under, and not America. So yeah, I think they're behaving as if they are enemies of the people, certainly.
I do too. I mean, when they side with our enemies and side against us just because they disagree with our politics, it's hard to see it any other way. That's not a friend, right? They're not our friends if they're doing that. And one of the most chilling things about what you just were talking about, and you alluded to with Psaki, is that, I mean, they're even letting Biden tell them, oh, you need to censor more. You need to suppress these views more. So the government is telling you to censor more, and you're listening to them. You're doing what they ask. You are working with the state to suppress certain views that disagree with yours. And I get that there is false information out there, but to me, don't tell me that you care about misinformation when you only care about it when it goes one way. If CNN publishes a false report, you're not going to do anything to them. You're not going to suppress the story. As a matter of fact, you might even help it spread more. So this isn't about misinformation. This is about politics, and that's what's scary about this whole thing.
Yep. And misinformation is in the eye of the beholder anyway. It changes, as we talked about with the Wuhan Institute of Virology theory. It changes day to day based off of, does this agree with the prevailing leftist narrative? This could cut chinks into it. Maybe we should suppress all of this speech that even allows people to think for themselves. And I've seen it, it's an ethos that we know what's best for you. It's so paternalistic. It doesn't let people refine their thinking against ideas that might clash with their own and then come to better conclusions. It stops it at its origins, which is not, again, it's the interrogation of ideas is foundational to a healthy democratic republic. And these companies are preventing it when they say misinformation is what we decide it is that day. So right. It's not helpful, and it doesn't allow these platforms to sort of act as what they said they were initially, the democratizers of information, this decentralized networks that would help people who didn't really have prominent voices or the means to have, or resources to have these big voices. It allowed them to connect with each other and air their perspectives and actually, do what makes America great is engage in the marketplace of ideas. At this point, you're tipping the scale. So we have to question, is this marketplace of ideas even genuine? I would argue that it's not when platforms are manipulating information and manipulating access to information in such prodigious ways.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, you can't say it's a free market of ideas, and you can't even say that you are for the spreading of ideas when you're trying to suppress the ones that just don't happen to agree with you. Instead of refuting it, you're just trying to shut it down. I want to talk more about the hearing that you testified in. Before that, just want to remind you guys to don't forget to head on over to libertynation.com, a proud sponsor of A Fresh Perspective. You can sign up for the daily briefing or subscribe to the member zone, or you can check out the latest cutting edge conservative news and analysis with none of the spin and all of the nuance. So check out original material on libertynation.com. Now, I want to ask you, this hearing, the title of it was Holding Big Tech Accountable. But it sounds like Democrats and Republicans have different ideas of what that means. And you had mentioned that the Democrats were proposing some solutions to big tech that might be problematic. Can you tell us about what some of these solutions were and why they are problematic?
Of course. And your listeners will probably be familiar with the Facebook whistleblower who released all those documents that constituted the Facebook files that the Wall Street Journal published throughout the fall of 2021. And she, in my opinion, the documents should speak for themselves. The Facebook's internal research revealed many things, especially toxic impacts on young teen girls and whatnot through Instagram, especially. Those documents, those facts, that research conducted by Facebook that was revealed by these documents should speak for themselves and stand alone. Because the second that this whistleblower with her army of Democrat consultants and the 60 Minutes rollout and the Senate hearing, the minute the solutions started being proposed, that's when I saw red flags and my spidey senses sort of went up. Then when it was sort of like, okay, it looks like she's proposing more censorship, more government oversight, involvement in policing speech in particular, the creation of more government power and expansion of that power and agencies to police the speech and, frankly, induce more censorship by these companies with a big federal government hand. That to me, conservatives were allergic to that in general, but this is that on steroids, right? We want sort of a ministry of information composed of people like, those who used to work at Facebook, who know the system and whatnot. Come on, that is not going to work. Frankly, I've worked for the federal government for almost a decade. They can barely get anything done at all. So creating more bloat like that, especially to censor and police speech of Americans, I do not think that is going to go well whatsoever. So Democrats and Republicans, not only do we sort of disagree on the problem diagnosis, we very much disagree on the proposed solutions. Dan Crenshaw in our House hearing actually did a good job of articulating this when he said, you think the problem, Democrats, you think the problem is there's not enough censorship on these platforms, but we as Republicans, as conservatives, think that the problem is there's too much censorship, and that's coming from Dan Crenshaw. He's saying that,
right.
And I agree with him. I think that there is too much censorship, and people on the other side would say there's not enough, and we're not doing enough to consider safety and harm and misinformation. Again, all of these words that change when the sun goes down and comes up. So.
Right.
That's sort of where we differ at the most fundamental levels.
So, I mean, and that's kind of what I expected you to say, because the Democrats are always going to want more government to do what they want, which is censorship. And if they have the power of the government on this, it's going to get even worse, because Facebook and all these social media companies are already horrible when it comes to censorship. But if they have the backing of the federal government, that's even more scary. What is the solution to this, Kara? I mean, how do we fix this? How do we deal with censorship in social media? I mean, is the solution in what we're already seeing with conservatives building their own media out, or do you think maybe the government couldn't step in and do something, or what do you think should be done here?
The creation of new companies that encompass all layers of the digital stack, that's a part of the solution. I think Section 230 reform is also part of the solution. We have a number of recommendations at Heritage when it comes to tightening up specific aspects of the law, striking the clause otherwise objectionable that tech companies have used broadly to basically keep themselves free from civil liability. So I think there are ways to tighten that up, to align it more with the intent of the law when it was passed in 1996. I think there are ways to give some of that enforcement teeth. I think that it is possible to help incentivize these companies to change their behavior, and transparency is one of those measures. So these companies, I believe, should be issuing transparency reports on how their content moderation policies are enacted, what they actually are, how they've made mistakes in the past and the number of the mistakes, and describe in detail that. They can talk about their algorithms and the impact that they have on users in particular. I think algorithmic transparency is critical as well. So all of that is sort of under the reform Section 230 bucket. Do other things too, by the power of Congress and the government itself. I think that state governments have a role to play here, and some states have been getting busy doing so. Ron DeSantis outlawed Zuckbucks in Florida. Great. Texas is attempting to get social media companies to not discriminate based on viewpoint. So when states can make these laws, I mean, the worst nightmare of some of these companies is a patchwork of restrictions in different states. That's not how tech companies sort of operate. So if they can sort of get them to shape their behavior by saying, hey, we're serious about actually holding you to account when you do these things, that could get them to potentially shape their behavior as well. And then I think it's interesting the role that civil society can play too. And this is where the sort of young teen girl impacts comes into play. You've seen some of the anti-critical race theory convulsion that parents have led in some of the states at a local grassroots level. If parents are mad about what these devices do to their children, and yes, I know parents have to be involved. There's a choice whether or not your kid gets a device in their hand and uses it. But to be honest, these products are designed to addict your children. As Representative Johnson said, handing your kid an Instagram profile, or allowing them to make one and having them scroll through, is like handing them a lit cigarette and hoping they get addicted for life. Zuckerberg even said, Facebook leadership even said that preteens were an untapped and valuable market to them. So these, it's not for nothing that you at times have to look at the dealer and not just the addict. You can't just blame parents, because this stuff is pervasive. So getting parents involved in this and raising their voices against what these tech companies are doing deliberately to court their children as a demographic, then they and potential user base, I think that's critical too. And then that founders piece that you talk about, we need to build, and we need to start now, because we have a lot of catching up to do. So I think those four things: Congress has a role, states have a role, civil society has a role, founders have a role. You can sort of attack them on all fronts and cut into some of the toxic things that they're doing to the body politic and our children.
So let me ask you this. I mean, especially when we talk about the Congress aspect of this, the midterms are coming up, and Republicans have a very good chance of retaking the House, maybe even the Senate. I mean, what do you think is going to happen? I mean, because a lot of these Republicans are speaking out against this, and they're saying they always say all the right things. They always say all the right things. Do you think that when Republicans have control of the government again, that they're going to actually do something, or is this just squishy talk, or just showboating?
I wish. I think we have a small window of opportunity, as I said in my testimony, to do something about these tech totalitarians trying to make one set of thinkers second-class citizens, and we have to do it now. So yeah, it briefs well, right? Everybody knows that generally some of these platforms are not doing us any favors as a society. That's our moral fabric comes into play. Our souls come into play when we see that. Attempts to get us to start going to church services in the metaverse in the future, that kind of thing. Not conducive to human flourishing whatsoever. But yeah, doing something about it. I think, especially on the right, are our own worst enemies, because we hide behind, these are private companies, don't touch them, don't you dare touch them. But at this point, I think the confluence of evidence, again, is grave and overwhelming, and people need to start taking a serious look at some legislative action that really does get after some of these issues, because frankly, big tech companies, they're not afraid of Washington, D.C., and they're not afraid of the right. Maybe they'll think a little bit about Lena Khan and on the left, and which was talking about the FTC. They don't want to be, antitrust. They don't want to be broken up, of course. Yeah. But when it comes to the right, they're like, those guys, they're never going to do anything. They like their private companies too much. They're never going to do anything. So that's sort of a consideration when you think about how these companies are sort of thinking and viewing DC. Generally, they think the locus of power of the universe is in Silicon Valley. You have to remember, these are global companies. They have vast global constituencies, especially in Facebook's case, almost 90% or nearly 90% of their user base, it might even be more now, is outside of the United States and Canada. Mm-hmm. So when they think of the centers of power, they themselves are the ones that are doing the real things, that are moving and changing the world. Those guys in DC with their sensible black shoes and their weird ill-fitted suits, come on. So that's one way to sort of think about how they think and act accordingly.
Yeah, and it's tough. I mean, because that even goes back to something that I talk about a lot. I mean, if Republicans aren't going to do anything about it, the ones that you sent to office, you need to get them out during the primary season. We never show up for primaries, but we always complain when we get these rhinos or these people who get into Congress and saying that they're going to take care of this and they don't. I mean, we only have ourselves to blame. And you know what you describe about the whole, free market thing? That describes me. I get it. I mean, because the libertarian side of me does not want the government to interfere with this. But there might be an idea that I might be willing to accept as long as it's not too intrusive. And the bottom line is, at some point, the government is going to get more involved. It's inevitable. It is inevitable. If it's going to, I would rather conservatives being the one to help steer that ship than the hard left, because if the hard left does it, we're going to be censored even more. But when it comes to the free market aspect, with conservatives building their own infrastructure and their own methods of communication, how do you see, if you could get out your crystal ball and look into it, what is this landscape going to look like in the future, maybe 5-10 years from now?
Oh, I hope very different. And I sort of think about the way that these new companies being created, I think about their success potential in the way that I think about what we would call the primes in the defense industry, like the Lockheed Martins of the world, these Boeings, these big companies in the defense space. And I think the only way that new entrants in that case are surviving is when they have billionaire backers, right? Like I talked about Palmer Luckey's company, Anduril, doing great. Luckily, Palmer got the money from selling Oculus, great founder. When Peter Thiel backs a Rumble of sorts, and now you're in free expression territory, not defense industry territory, then I think the prognosis for success becomes greater. So in 10 years, hopefully, let 1,000 Rumbles bloom, right? And we don't have, do we have that many billionaires? I'm not actually sure. We certainly don't have that many conservative or libertarian minded billionaires or free thinking heterodox billionaires. I wish. Right. But I think once, if I could clone Peter Thiel, I would do it 1,000 times over. And I think that would be helpful. What I think a lot of people don't understand, or at least don't say too much, is that there's a huge first mover advantage from a technical standpoint that the Googles have, that the Amazon Web Services have. In Google's search capabilities in particular, I mean, they've had the ability to collect a high volume and variety of data on users for years. And all of those technical advantages compound upon each other. You can use all of that to refine your algorithms and make a great product for the users. That's why people want to use Google right now. I use a lot of DuckDuckGo because in doing research for a lot of these projects, it was crazy how I was trying to confirm instances of conservative censorship. You couldn't even find anything on Google. I had to go to
Yeah.
DuckDuckGo to actually find and surface the information.
I've had to do that too. Yep.
Yeah, and Joe Rogan's even talked about this. Like, when you
Mhm.
can't trust the search engine of our lives, you have a problem. So I think a lot more people, they know about things like DuckDuckGo, and they're actually not conservatives, at least from my last research of whoever founded that company. But I think right now you have to, at base level, have those redundancies or alternatives that you use, right? Conservatives, even if you still go on YouTube, you should also go on Rumble. If you want to upload
Mhm.
videos and you have a YouTube account, also have one on Rumble. Redundancy, building in those redundancies is the bare minimum that we have to do. And hopefully in the future, we'll be able to have better user experiences once those
Right.
technical advantages start to accrue and the product itself gets much better. But we have to start somewhere.
Yeah, and I think you hit a key point there with the user experience. I mean, one of the reasons why I don't use a lot of the alternative social medias is because they tend to be clunky. So now I do like Rumble, but like with some of the, like with Parler, I have an account on there, but I don't really use it because it's just the interface is very clunky. But I mean, that's stuff that will get solved over time. But here's what I'm worried about, and I want to get your reaction to this to see what you think. Maybe I'm being too paranoid. Like I said earlier, I like the fact that conservatives are building their own infrastructure. I don't like the reason why they're doing it. I don't like that they have to do it. I understand the reason why, and I agree with it. I mean, if the alternative is just to roll over and just let them censor us, and we're not doing that. But here's my concern: we will become a lot more siloed in the way we consume our media. We already are to a certain extent, but not to the extent that it's going to get to if this initiative works, which I think it will. So we were talking about echo chambers, and when we have more siloed social media and more siloed internet between progressive and conservative, won't that further contribute to the division that we're seeing today? And how is that going to affect American society? I mean, we're already at each other's throats. If we're not even in a place where we're talking to each other, or we're talking to each other less, how is that going to impact our society going forward? I mean, I think it's going to have a bad impact. But maybe I'm being too paranoid. Maybe there's something I'm not seeing. What do you think?
No, I agree with you. It's less than ideal. But I'll say two things. Number one, people like the CEO of Babylon Bee, Seth Dillon, and other luminaries in the space like Rachel Bovard, they say that we have to fight for our right to be on these platforms. And I agree with them to some extent, right? So, yeah, being on Twitter is still useful for us as conservatives because we can reach a smaller portion of the population than we would normally, or if we were lefties on Twitter. But we're still there. We're still fighting good ideas. You've seen like some of Tucker Carlson's segments are based off of Twitter anons and what, the ideas that they're putting out on Twitter. So it's still very important. So that's why I say requisite is having those redundancies built in, but staying on the platforms. I think I agree with those two individuals I mentioned. I think it is important as well. But again, we have to have an alternative. The other thing I would say is, it's not just social media companies and big tech companies that are doing this. The trajectory of a constriction of digital life is happening on smaller platforms as well. If you look at Shopify, they kicked all official Trump merchandise off after January 6th. Online fundraising platforms. You're probably familiar with the GoFundMe snafu that happened after Kyle Rittenhouse was originally sort of brought in. And then when he was acquitted, people were like, hey, GoFundMe, didn't you restrict any contributions to his legal fund? They did, while at the same time supporting and actually paying money to the rioters in Wisconsin and other places. So I think it's sort of important to remember, the hypocrisy there. And then you have other platforms as well, Kickstarter, and other platforms that are email delivery services, ISPs like GoDaddy. They refused to host a website that was trying to support the Texas anti-abortion law, the Heartbeat Act. They kicked off one of the sites because they didn't want to be supporting that law. So it's a whole array of digital services.
And financial institutions too on the internet. I mean, they have cut ties with certain key figures on the right, like Laura Loomer. I'm not a fan of hers, but I mean, what they did to her was wrong. And
Exactly.
they're doing that to others too. So it is going to get to where it's going to impact people's pocketbooks if they speak out certain ideas. It's scary. So yeah, we do need to build the infrastructure. But I mean, I think overall it's going to hurt, but it's also going to help, because at least people will still be able to consume different ideas. They can still go to Twitter, like you said. Like I tell people, if you're going to use Getter or whatever, that's fine. Don't leave Twitter though, because that means that our message isn't getting out there at all, and it's just going to create another echo chamber for the left to dominate.
Yep. And I think you're exactly right. So, and you made my point when I was even less articulate than you, because when you say, we're worried about a world where all the righties are on one thing and the lefties are on another thing. But when it comes to online digital platforms and payment services and whatnot, sometimes that might be our only choice. So we have to prepare for that now. And I totally agree with you on the Twitter aspect. Most people, I've had people come to me and say, oh, Twitter doesn't matter. I'm not on Twitter. So therefore, it's not even that important. I'm fine. I'm living a great life. Yes, but you have to understand that most journalists, as you say, these activists are on Twitter. Politicians are on Twitter. More local politicians are on Twitter. This is where some crazy lefty ideas are being thrown against the wall, right? Like spaghetti, to see if they stick. They start to bubble up when they're thrown out there, and actually have real world effects. So even if you're not interested in Twitter or places like it, they're interested in you, and they might have material impacts on how you live your life because of these rando ideas generated on Twitter, which is a lefty dominated platform. So I think it's important to see the significance of these platforms and see them for what they are, instead of just saying, I'm not on it, so it actually doesn't matter. Hey, I'm not on Facebook anymore, but it does matter.
It does. Yeah. I mean, and I think that I know it's like I agree with Dave Chappelle when he says Twitter isn't a real place. It isn't a real place, but it is still important. It still has an influence in our society. So even if you're not on it, we should all still be concerned about these issues. So was there anything that I didn't bring up that you want to talk about? Any question that I didn't ask that you want to talk about?
No, I think we pretty much hit everything. I think we plumbed the depths of what we've got here for today.
What are you going to be doing next?
Yeah, so we'll be coming out with papers from the Heritage Foundation, sort of detailing more of these aspects of censorship, sort of projecting what trends are coming down the line for digital surveillance. One thing that I think is very interesting, and it's happening in what us techies call meat space, so the physical world, is that inflation of the definition of domestic extremism. When you look at the National School Board Association, you're familiar with that drama when they worked with the White House to write the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, and classify these parents, when it came to their anti-critical race theory efforts, to classify these parents as domestic extremists, terrorists, and whatnot. Those words are very important when it comes to law. I spent my entire career doing counterterrorism on behalf of the US government. Right now, what I'm seeing when it comes to that definition inflation that will, I'm sure, normalize these patterns of behavior for digital life is very, very scary. Calling people that you disagree with viewpoint-wise domestic terrorists, sicking the Department of Justice and the counterterrorism division of the FBI on these parents, using threat tags to classify them in a way that is familiar to counterterrorism analysts, that is very, very dangerous, I believe. And I think we're starting to see that happen in the digital space with the expansion of this definition. Facebook instituting a pilot system that warns you if you might have had engagement with extremists online.
Yes, I saw that. Yeah.
In July. Yep. So it's that kind of thing. It's the repurposing of these counterterrorism tools to target ordinary Americans for their viewpoint. That is coming down the pike for conservatives. That is something we should be very attuned to and be on the lookout for. And the Heritage Foundation will lead the way in exposing these practices.
Good. I mean, hopefully I can have you back on to talk about these things, because I mean, we were thorough here, but there are still other elements here that need to be discussed. And you have a lot of knowledge on this, apparently. I mean, it's like you carry a lot of knowledge on this stuff. That's stuff that I didn't know about. So that is very valuable. So I want as many people to know about this as possible. So hopefully we can do this again. But in the meantime, why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, of course. So I'm at the Heritage Foundation, so heritage.org. You can find we have a bevy of scholars, much better than I am, much smarter than I am. So take a look at all of our work. We do things from tax policy to anything that has to do with the Supreme Court, to technology policy, to foreign policy. So heritage.org. You can search my name really quickly. You'll find most of my work there. Heritage.org/big tech, that consolidates most of our big tech work and media work there. So find us at heritage.org, and thanks for hearing me out.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining me. I look forward to the next time.
Same.